Ose shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru, imru, amen. Yaseh shalom, Shalom Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, 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 v'meru. Amen. We'll continue with the full Kaddish. I invite people to unmute to be able to respond to the Kaddish. Ikadav ikadash me rabba. Alma dibrach yirtei v'emlich malchutei v'chayachon v'yemachon v'chay v'chol beit Yisrael b'agalav izman kariv v'meru. Amen.
Yesh me rabba mevorach ve'olam olam e'onaya yitbarach
Shabbat, Vitvar Trom Naseh, Vitadar Tleiftoal, Shmei the Kudasha,
Briku
Elam in Kolberchata Vishirata, Tishpata V'nachamata, Tamiran Be'alma V'meru.
Amen.
Yitkabel Tonoton, the Chol Beit Yisrael, Kadam V'hon Divishmaya V'meru.
Amen.
Hey Shalom Rabba Min Shemaya, V'chaim Alinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'meru.
Amen.
Ose Shalom Imromav, Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael, V'al Kol Yishrei Tevel V'meru.
Amen.
And we will go back on mute with the hopeful exception of Barry Pastor, who, if he's up for it, I will ask to unmute himself again and take us through the beginning of the Torah service. Barry, you good to go if I put it on the screen?
I'll try it.
All right.
I can't vouch for the technology.
Well, I'll back you up if you cut out.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready, Barry.
Ein kamocha be'elim Adonai ve'ein kemasecha malchusecha malchus kol olamim umemshaltecha b'chol dor v'dor Adonai melech Adonai malach Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed Adonai oz li'amo yitain Adonai yivorech esamo b'shalom avorachamim Eitiv avetzon koes Zion Tivnei chomos Yerushalayim Ki v'chol levad b'tochnu Melech Eram v'nisa Adon olamim. Vayi ben Aharon Vayomer Moshe Kuma Adonai v'yafutzu oivecha v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha ki mitzion teitze sora Ki mitzion teitze sora udevar Adonai mirushalayim Baruch Shenasan Torah Torah. Baruch Shenasan Torah Torah. Ne'amo Yisrael B'Kedusha So.
Thank you so much, Barry. Technology held out, so that's always good coming from Exeter. And looks like anyone who was standing may be seated, who's already seated, but just in case, you may all be seated. Shabbat Shalom once again. Thank you all for coming together this morning. As I mentioned earlier, this morning we will be reading Parshat Noach, and where we pick up in terms of the triennial cycle this week is actually right after the flood. So the first verse we'll be reading this morning comes from Genesis 8 verse 15. God spoke to Noah saying, "Come out of the ark together with your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives." So the return to dry land, the return to kind of reestablishing life on earth. And I feel I'm definitely struck this week and this year, and by just how crazy a story this is. I think especially, so now we're doing it twice a month. We're doing this Friday evening Shabbat sing along and story time for little kids. And so, in preparing for that yesterday, I found a nice little storybook that told the story of Noah and collecting all the animals, and everyone was smiling and all the animals were getting along, and the ship is getting tossed along by the waves. And it's, we've made it into a nice story, but I don't think there is any other story in the entire Torah that is quite so terrifying when we really get down to it. As we get really starting at the end of this week, when Abraham comes on the scene, or Avram as he is before, he establishes his relationship with God. From this point on in the Torah, there is always kind of that there's a middleman, right? There's someone who is there to kind of calm God's worst urges. And what we get specifically with Noah as compared to Abraham is the classic, what did it mean that Noah was a righteous man in his generation? And a lot of the rabbinic commentary says that means he wasn't actually that great, because they compare him to Abraham, who ran around in circles trying to convince God not to destroy the city of Sodom, versus Noah, who kind of gets this dire warning from God and hops on the boat with all the animals and, goes off on his storm-tossed way. And so it's really kind of remarkable that, what to think about the relationship between humanity and God. And ultimately, we'll start focusing a little bit more in the coming weeks on the growing relationship between what will become the Israelite people and God, without having that that person in the middle to kind of placate and discuss and try to talk down. And so, and I think, and in terms of what we'll actually be reading today, I think we really do get the kind of the bringing home of this story as not a children's story, is not necessarily a story where we're even supposed to focus on the happy ending, because what we'll read about this morning is Noah getting off the ark and planting a vineyard and getting drunk, because he's a man who is basically, yes, he's identified as a righteous person, and yes, he's communicated with God, but he's also a man who kind of stood by while the entire world was swept away from in front of his eyes while he was on the ark. And yeah, all this basically came about for me because I was trying to communicate this to a group of little kids who, you want them to sing the happy songs of 2 by 2 and all that, but there's definitely a lot more to this story. And I invite you to keep that in mind. Just 1 second, Mike. I invite you to keep that in mind as we do read through a chunk of the text this morning. And obviously, Noah is such a rich parsha from beginning to end. It actually does fit the triennial cycle very well, because last year, in year one, we read about the coming of the flood. In year two, we read about kind of Noah and after the flood and the rainbow. And then in year three, we get the story of Babel and the introduction to Abraham. So really every year you get something that is just really rich and needs to be unpacked. The other thing I'll ask you all to keep in mind as we read through the text is what's going on with the rainbow, and the rainbow as a sign, and the rainbow as a sign of a covenant between God and humanity, and what the significance and symbolism is there, because that's what we'll dive into a little bit more after the Torah reading. I saw Mike maybe wanted to say something, and possibly Joel also.
Well, yeah, just when you were talking about the story, not, we remember the good parts, or we teach the good parts, the ark and the animals and all. But then that brings me to two Jewish stories, one of which is in the Bible, one is not, but you have Purim, or you have the book of Esther, and you have Hanukkah. And we always focus on all when we tell the stories to our children, the good parts of it. There's a lot of bad parts after the good parts happen. So I'm just thinking that came to mind when you made those comments.
Yeah, for sure. And definitely, listen, I don't think it's incumbent upon any of us to try to scare the heck out of our kids or grandkids, right? That's not what we're here for. But maybe what we're here for is to be able to look at these events a little bit more fully, and without necessarily glossing over the parts that might strike us as a little bit more kind of harder to explain, or possibly, disturbing. So yeah, certainly, Mike, that is true. You go through the stories we tell our kids that are based in Jewish Torah texts, and it certainly is a very much a censored version that we pass on. Joel, did you want to say something?
Yeah. I sit in on a Jewish meditation every Thursday morning with a Rabbi Yael Levy, who has a website, The Way In. And she does a little drash before we meditate. And she said this week that, so Noah takes care of the animals on the boat. It's a kind of an arduous job. She says that we should take from that we learn compassion and caring for others by caring for the natural world. Gardening, appreciating the birds, taking care of pets, etc. And I thought that was really nice.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I certainly think, there's a million different parables you could read into the story of Noah, right? And especially, and I don't think this isn't something I have prepped cleanly enough to want to bring it in, and it's also just not where I intended on focusing this morning. But in the age of climate change, you could make a great drash on Parshat Noah, and how important it is essentially to care for the world before things are irreversibly too late, right? That's where Noah's coming in, is he's basically caring for things after irreparable damage has been done, and that's kind of where God is coming in and saying, well, I need to wipe the slate clean. And so that ideal of constant care and constant caretaking and constant building is really a much better alternative to what we see from to the world of Noah. So thank you for bringing that in. There's certainly environmental lessons and parables to be drawn out here. Any other comments or questions before we get going with the Torah reading? Great. I also, just looking at the list, I didn't see that anyone here has Yortzeit this week, but also parents' names are sometimes different than children's names. So I just want to confirm that no one is here to observe Yortzeit. Okay, then I think we will get going. It's a relatively long Torah reading, but a chunk of that is also, we're kind of working our way from the generations of Noah to the generations of Abraham. So a chunk of it is names, which, we'll read through pretty quickly. I don't know if I'll stop or not, but as always, I encourage anyone who, if you have a question or a comment or something is striking you as interesting, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll do my best to check in with that and to pause if we want to discuss as we go. Otherwise, I will take us all off mute so that we can say La'asok b'divrei Torah together, and then we will begin with this morning's Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher
kishanu
mitzvotav
v'tzivanu
asok
b'divrei Torah.
Torah. Amen. Just pull it up. Great. And if anyone has a chumash that they're following along with at home, we are on page 48. Amen. Vayidaber Elohim el Noach lemor. Say min hateva ata v'ishtecha uvanecha u'shnei vanecha u'neshei vanecha itach kol hachaya asher itcha mikol basar ba'of u'vabehema u'v'chol haremes haromes al haaretz hayotze itach v'shartzu va'aretz ufaru v'rabu al haaretz vayetze Noach uvanav v'ishto u'neshei vanav ito kol hachaya kol haremes v'chol ha'of kol romes al haaretz lemishbechotehem yatzu min hateva Vayiven Noach mizbeach l'Adonai vayikach mikol habehema hatehora umikol ha'of hatahor vayal olot b'mizbeach vayarach Adonai et reach hanichoach vayomer Adonai el libo lo osif lekalel od et hadama bavur ha'adam ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra minurav v'lo osif od lakot et kol chai kasher asiti od kol yemei haaretz zera v'katzir v'kor v'chom v'kayitz v'choref v'yom v'layla lo yishbotu vayevarech Elohim et Noach ve'et banav vayomer lahem pru'ervu umilu et haaretz umorachem v'chitchem yeh al kol chayat haaretz ve'al kol of hashamayim Bechol asher tirmos hadama v'chol degei hayam be'edchem nitanu kol remes asher hu chai lachem yeh leochla keyerek esev natati lachem et kol ach basar b'nafsho damo lo tochelu ve'ach etimchem l'nafshotechem edrosh miyad kol chaya edreshenu Umiyad ha'adam, miyad ish achiv edrosh et nefesh ha'adam, shofech dam ha'adam, ba'adam damo yishafech, ki betzelem Elohim asat ha'adam, ve'atem peru urvu, shirtu va'aretz urvu va'ah. And I just want to highlight a couple things here. It's hard to look at Genesis. It's hard to look at Noach separate from Breshit and really do a little bit of comparing and contrasting. And so, and also kind of, again, compare and contrast what is commanded to Adam versus what is commanded to Noach. And for those of you who are following along in the text, this week and last week, what we just read is really a transition. And this even goes back to what Joel said, for better or worse. We really do see a transition from the commandments to Adam upon creation of really like caring and being a part of the world, to Noah and all future generations to being a role more of like dominance and ruling over the world. And thinking about how those attitudes really reflect down to this day as to what is our own relationship and behavior towards nature and towards the natural world, I think is really interesting. And the other thing to note is just in the last verse we read, we get referenced one more time that humanity is made in the image of God. Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech ki b'tselem Elohim asat ha'adam. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in God's image did God make man. And it's just an interesting thing to note that gets repeated. I think that's really central to our own conception of Judaism and a lot of our personal relationships with God. And it's nice that it gets mentioned again. This is also, I think, the last time it gets mentioned, right? So, we mention it in Genesis and in Noah, and then we really don't come back. We come back to it. The text doesn't come back to it. Yeah, Sharon, unmute yourself and go ahead.
It just strikes me that this is almost like Moshe passing the torch to Joshua, that this is God passing the torch to humanity almost. It's like, you're in charge now, guys, and he's not an extraordinary human being. He's a very everyman human being. So I think that's important as well. It's kind of that partnership that we talk about between the deity and the humanity, that now it's our game in a sense.
Yeah. And I think in a lot of ways there's almost kind of like, depending on how you read this, you can almost see it as like God kind of throwing God's hands up a little bit, right? It's like when the creation initially happened and Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, God kind of assumed that everything would work out perfectly. And it's kind of from this point onwards that it's like, you know what? It's flawed. I'm not going to try to wipe it all away again, but also like we're just going to kind of, march on ahead and make the best of it. And yeah, so I think it is appropriate in some ways that Noah, that as you said, Noah is the everyman, right? Because we're not working within a system of a messianic system where one person's going to come and kind of fix it all or save us all. We were kind of, from this point on, we're doing the best with what we got, I would say. Yeah, let's go to Gene since they're already unmuted, and then we'll go to Mom.
So I have a question. I haven't picked up on this before, but line 20 and page 49, Noah is sacrificing animals. And I'm being very literal here for a moment. They've just gone through all of this. They've got 2 by 2, all these animals. And now finally they're getting off the boat and he's sacrificing them. And how does this work? How does that species perpetuate itself if they're being sacrificed now?
That's a good question.
So it's a great question. And again, this is kind of comes back from us not reading the full Parsha every year. But whatever is deemed a pure animal, and again, we're not quite in law book mode yet, so we don't know what a pure animal is and isn't. But in chapter 7, part of the instruction was that you'll take everything 2 by 2, but pure animals you're going to take 7. So there is almost this like plan in advance for God to mandate sacrifices to God, which is an interesting, because yeah, otherwise you're right, Gene. This sacrifice would have meant that the cow or the sheep or the goat never would have made it down to us, to read it literally. But that's where the logistics work out, I would say. And Barry says maybe he sacrificed a unicorn. I don't know if the unicorns had cloven hooves or not. but yeah, I mean, there's been all kinds of, if you look through like the canon of, New Yorker style cartoons, there's all kinds of humor out there about what things did and didn't make it onto the ark. And yeah, so does that, yeah. So, and Mom, you wanted to say something as well?
Yeah, so I from Jean's verse 20, I want to move towards verse 21, which is, kind of a very anthropomorphic kind of image of God that I know I've always kind of enjoyed and holding on to as a lover of food and good smells of food, because it says God smelled the smells of the wonderful smells of the sacrifices, and going forward to other places in the 5 books where there's so much emphasis on sacrifices, and I always love this phrase of reach nichoach, of a wonderful smell. But also the next part of the sentence where God says to his heart, I mean, there's like a very self-reflective kind of moment where God does not talk to the angels, but rather an unusual moment of God's talking about, I will never again destroy mankind. It's just it's powerful. He talks about, man's evil inclines, but this is a pretty powerful moment. And then the next part, the development of God with mankind.
Yeah, and I think, the thing about the sacrifices is definitely to be discussed a little bit more extent when we get to Vayikra and when we get to Leviticus. But it is interesting the way, we think of that middle, the book of Leviticus as this kind of like irrelevant, detached, totally separate from the rest of the 5 books, not necessarily, something we can learn lessons from. But there is this undercurrent of sacrifice going all the way from, from Breshit, Genesis, right? Like from Cain and Abel giving an offering, and here to Noah giving an offering, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's certainly something that comes, with us throughout the Torah, and is something that is really important, both to relationship building and to us trying to figure out where we can find relevance in this text about sacrifices. And what you're pointing out also about God kind of reflecting to God's self about never wanting to do this again, I think is a really interesting point that as we continue to run through the text, and again, I'm going to ask you all to focus in on the rainbow stuff when we get to that in just a moment or two. A lot of what's going on in this parsha is internally within God. This isn't necessarily God. Yes, it's God interacting with humanity and the whole natural world. And yes, there is kind of limited direct interaction between God and Noah. And certainly it's not super dialogue based, right? Like God and Noah don't have back and forth the same way that like God and Moses or even, God and Abraham have back and forth. A lot of what's happening is kind of squarely within the realm of God's own, process, whatever that might be. Joel, yeah.
So I'm going to bring something up that may be too big to deal with now, but it says man's heart is evil from his youth. Can you say something about that in relation to Christian's original sin?
I can't speak to it in relation to Christian's original sin. I don't have the background to speak confidently on that, but I do think this goes back a little bit to what Sharon brought up and to what we were discussing beforehand, just about, kind of moving on from the idea of creating a perfect world or a perfect humanity. And if Joel, if you can send me a text or an email after Shabbat, I will try to reach out to some clergy friends who might be able to, if you repeat that question to me, I'll reach out to some clergy friends who might be able to weigh in from a spot of a little bit more kind of concrete knowledge there.
Okay.
Thank you. And I saw, Barry, you messaged me that Barbara Ann has your site. I'd like to keep reading a little bit more, and then we'll pause again kind of when we do another chunk of the Torah reading, and we'll pause for an El Male. So we are back in the text, and we are on page 51, chapter 9, verse 8. Amen. Vayomer Elohim el Noach el banav ito lemor va'ani hineni mekim et briti itchem ve'tzarachem acharechem ve'et kol nefesh achaya asher itchem ba'of ba'behema v'chol chayat haaretz itchem Mikol yotzei hateva l'chol chayat haaretz v'kimoti et briti itchem v'lo yikaret kol basar od mimei hamabul v'lo yeh od mabul l'shachet haaretz vayomer Elohim zot ota brit asher ani noten beini uveinechem uvein Kol nefesh chaya asher itchem lidorot olam et kashti natati be'anan ve'ayta le'ot brit beini uvein haaretz ve'haya banani anan al haaretz v'nirata hakeshet be'anan v'zecharti et briti asher beini uveinechem uvein Kol nefesh chaya b'chol basar v'lo yeh od hamayim lamabul l'shachet kol basar v'ayta keshet be'anan uriti ha lizkor berit olam bein Elohim uvein kol nefesh chaya b'chol basar asher al haaretz vayomer Elohim el Noach Zot ot brit asher hakimoti beini uven kol basar asher al haaretz. So we'll pause there one more time, and we did just read the rainbow section that I think is really fascinating. And the last thing I'll say before I talk more about it at the end is just noting how we've kind of been focusing on the relationship between God and humanity, but this is also a very universal moment, right? Like God is saying that this is a covenant not just between God and humanity, but between God and all of creation, because all the animals and the roaming things and all the creatures that were created were also kind of swept up in this flood. And so whatever is promised here is not actually exclusive to man. It is inclusive of all of nature, or at least all of animal nature, which I think brings us back to what Joel said before we even started, kind of how deeply incumbent it is upon us to actively care for the natural world and protect the natural world. Yeah, Sharon, please.
Okay, I have a question. It just occurred to me that when he talks about the rainbow, it's keshet, it's a bow. Is that the same word that we use in archery? It is, isn't it?
It is, and we are going to come back to that unless you have a direct follow-up question
But
right
just that if it is, it's like a potential weapon that becomes a symbol of not destroying. I never quite got that before. Yeah.
Don't give away my drash for this morning, but the Ramban also gets to that point, so we will revisit that, and that's a great catch on your part. Joel, did you want to say something too?
Yeah, a few years ago, I looked up in the sky during the day, about 12 or 1, and this is what I saw. I don't know if we can do this. Oh, here we go. Whoops. Well, anyway, there was a rainbow in a cloud. And I did some research on it. And the research said there is always a rainbow in the sky. When we see a little piece of rainbow, which is called a sundog, that's because of refraction, all that, just the piece of the full rainbow that's going on. So when God said that I'll put this rainbow in the clouds, it's always there, which I think is pretty wonderful. Let's see if I can get to show you this. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Another really interesting thought, and something again that we will revisit at the end at our discussion after the Torah reading. So both you and everyone else who just heard it, file it away for a couple more minutes.
There it is.
Joel, why don't you can you email that to me, and that way I can put it up for everyone
Sure.
later. We'll be able to see it a little bit more clearly. Thank you. And then before we continue on with the Torah reading, Barry and Barbara Ann, you have your site this week?
Mother.
And her Hebrew name?
She's a Yiddish name. It's Fredka Merrill Ba'arenka Vabatya.
Ba'arenka Vabatya. All right, so we will include, we'll take a moment to include an El Male for Barbara Ann's mother. El Male Rachamim Shochein Bamromim Hamtzei Menucha Nechona Kanfei Ashchina B'malot Kedoshim Uteorim Kezor Harakia Mazhirim Et Nishmat Fred Camero Bat Arenka V'Batya Shalcha Lolama Bavur Shanach Mitpalim Bad Hashkarat Nishmata Began Eden Temenuchata Lachain Balarachamim Yastira Beseter Knafecha Leolamim Vitror Vitrochem et Nishmata Adonahu Lachalata V'tanuach B'Shalom Mishkava V'nomar Amen. Barbara Ann, if you want to take a few moments to share something about your mother.
Yeah, my mother was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and went to Carnegie, well, now it's Carnegie Mellon University as a dramat at a time when darkness was upon the face of the earth because of the steel mills. When she would get out of school at midday, it would be totally dark. She went on to write amazing sisterhood productions for the synagogue, which were put on by all the women in the congregation, and she founded the McKeesport Little Theater, which is one of the few things in my hometown that still exists. Pretty much everything else has gone the way of steel towns. She read stories with multiple voices, which was always amazing. And she was,
The birdies on.
oh yeah, well, that's funny, Barry. What
Go ahead, say
what
it.
what are you talking? How?
Never mind.
What about it?
She wrote it, didn't she?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, she wrote a lot of. I don't know what you're. I don't know exactly what you're asking.
Song that she sang to the grandkids.
Oh yeah, well she made up a lot of songs and things that she sang to the grandkids that were quite amazing, and that they eventually made into a book for her. And she went from Pennsylvania to Florida to California at the end of her life. Gnug.
Well, thank you for sharing. Certainly a lot of, sounds like a lot of creativity and dramatic flair and really wonderful, wonderful memories. So thank you for bringing that in for us.
Yep, thank you.
So we will turn back to the Torah reading. We are on page 52, chapter 9, verse 18. And this is where we're going to transition to Noah, to the kind of dark episode of Noah falling apart a little bit, planting a vineyard, getting drunk, being exposed to one of his sons, cursing his son. And then after that, a long list of lineage, which I will try to read through relatively quickly. So we're on chapter 9, verse 18. Amen. Vayu bnei Noach hayotzim min hateva Shem v'Cham ve'Yafet v'Cham hu avi Canaan shlosha ele bnei Noach ume'ele nafza kol haaretz vayachel Noach ish hadama vayita karem vayesh min hayayin vayishkar vayitgal betoch Ohalo vayar Cham avi Canaan et ervat aviv vayaged lishnei achav bachutz vayikach Shem veyafet et hasimla vayasimu al Shechem shnehem vayelchu achronit vayechesu et ervat avihem Ufnehem achoranit varvat avihem lo ra'u vayiket Noach me'eino vayeda et asher asalo beno hakatan vayomer arur Canaan eved avadim yelechav vayomer Baruch Adonai Elohei Shem vayi Canaan eved lamo Yaf Elohim layefet vayishkon bo halei Shem vayi Canaan eved lamo vayichi Noach achar hamabul shalosh meot shana v'chamishim shana vayihi kol yemei Noach tesha meot shana v'chamishim shana vayamot ve'ele toldot b'nei Noach Shem Cham ve'Yafet vayivaldu lahem banim achar hamabul b'nei Yafet Gomer umagog umadai v'Yavan ve'Tubal umeshech v'Tiras uvnei Gomer Ashkenaz v'Rifat v'Togarma uvnei Yavan Elisha v'Tarshish Kitim v'Dodanim me'ele nifredu Yeh hagoyim bartzotam ish lil shono lemishpachotam begoyehem uvnei Cham kush mitzrayim ufut uchnaan uvnei kush seva v'chavila v'savta v'rama v'savtecha uvnei Rama sheva uddan Bechush yaladet Nimrod hu heichel liot gibor ba'aretz hu haya gibor tzayid lifnei Adonai al ken ye'amar kenimrod gibor tzayid lifnei Adonai v'tehi reshit mamlachto v'avel v'erech ve'akad v'chalna v'eretz shinar Min haaretz hahi yatsa Ashur vayiven et Ninveh vet rechovot ir vet kalach ve'et resen ben Ninveh uvein kalach hi ha'ir hagdola umitzrayim yalad et ludim vet anamim vet lahavit vet naftuchim vet patrusim vet kasluchim asher yatzu misham פלישתים ואת כפתורים, וכנען ילד, ואת צידון בכורו ואת חית, ואת היבוסי ואת האמורי ואת הגרגשי, ואת החיבי ואת הערכי ואת הסיני, ואת הערבדי ואת הצמרי ואת החמתי, ואחר נחצו משפחות הכנעני, ויהיו גבול הכנעני מצידון, בואכה גררה עד עזה, בואכה סדומה ועמורה, ועל עמל צבועים עד לשעה. אלה בני חם למשפחותם ולשנותם בארצותם בגוייהם, ולשם יולד גם הוא אבי כל בני עבר, אחי יפת הגדול, בני שם אילם ואשור, וארפחשד ולוד וארם, ובני ארם עוץ וחול וגתר ומש, וארפחשד ילד את שלח, ושלח ילד את עבר, ולעבר יולד שני בנים, שם האחד פלג, כי בימיו נפלגה הארץ, ושם אחיו יקטן, ויקטן ילד את אלמודד ואת שלף ואת חצר רמה ואת ירח, ואת הדורם ואת עוזל ואת דקלה, ואת עובל ואת אבימעאל ואת שבה, ואת עופר ואת חבילה ואת יובב, כל אלה בני יקטן, ויהי מושבם מימי שע, בואכה ספרה הר הקדם. אלה בני שם למשפחותם ולשנותם בארצותם לגוייהם. אלה משפחות בני נוח לתולדותם בגוייהם, ומאלה נפרדו הגויים בארץ אחר המבול. All right, lots of genealogy and Hebrew that is very difficult to read. Probably one of the slight advantages to me being able to read it out of the Chumash and not the Torah, because that would have gone a lot more bumpy had I not had the vowels in front of me. Yeah, and Deb, was that a hand? You need to unmute yourself. And maybe just introduce yourself very briefly, because I don't know if anybody but my parents know you.
Well, I'm a fan of your parents and of you. I'd like to go back.
It's 11 o'clock.
I'd like to go back to the Keshet. To me, that's the definitive point where God resigns from the point of being an omniscient God. He's making a promise not to destroy the world anymore. By the same token, he's given the responsibility of the ongoing part to man. Man has the responsibility for the earth now.
Yeah, I wonder, I think it's a really interesting perspective. I wonder if it's not so much that God is giving up the omniscience, but more so that God is kind of promising not to always act on the omniscience, right? Like, I don't think God is stepping back from necessarily the position of power and might that God occupies of knowing everything that's going on. I think it's almost more creating a barrier between the knowing and the doing, right? And so, you know, it comes with this admission that I think Sharon mentioned before, that, or I forget who mentioned it before, I'm sorry, that you know, man is kind of born to be evil all his days. And I think what the transition that God is making in God's own behavior is acknowledging that evilness without constantly trying to fix it, or at least not trying to fix it for the face of all of humanity. And this is the one pact, the one covenant that we see that is with all of humanity and all of creation. And I think what you're kind of pointing at, Deb, is that at the end of this week's Parsha, we'll meet Abraham, right? We'll meet Abraham. And that's really where the transition kind of fully makes itself, right? God is no longer going to worry, at least our conception and the Torah's conception of God, God is no longer going to worry about all of humanity as this one unified kind of controllable thing, but rather God is going to choose a people, right? And hope that that people can follow in God's ways and really raise itself above that evil, that nature that God has kind of resigned to accepting in humanity. And I think, so I think that is, you know, one of the very kind of remarkable transitions that we're seeing in Parshat Noach, and looking forward to next week in Parshat Lech Lecha. Joel, and then Mike, and then the healing service. Joel, you're still muted.
So Ham is referred to twice as Canaan's father, and then Canaan is cursed because of, I don't get it.
Yeah. And so one of the things that comes out of Parshat Noach is kind of redividing the world, right? Like we initially had Adam and Eve created last week, and that was kind of the seed of the whole world. And then population grew, and then this, you know, then the flood happens, and so there's kind of a constriction again of the population. And you know, originally humanity was all the children of Adam, and now we're kind of hitting reset and saying humanity is all the children of Noah. And of course, you know, as we're reflecting, this is not a process that is all super smooth puppies and rainbows. This is something that, again, turns back into divisiveness and human nature not being exactly what anybody wants it to be. And so, you know, Canaan becomes kind of the new symbol of division, I would say. And so instead of, you know, one person, Noah, getting to start all of humanity and having, you know, 3 sons, each of whom are exemplary, and their grandchildren are exemplary, and we're working towards a peace and brotherly love and all that, you know, immediately it's kind of resetting the stage for conflict. And you know, it's not necessarily an answer that will make you feel warm inside, but I do think that's kind of what's being set up narratively. And then Mike, did you?
Yeah, I just with all those names, grandchildren mostly, I was struck by the number of them that correspond to Jewish names for countries today, or Hebrew name like Ashkenaz. I didn't maybe overlooked that before, and Mitzrayim, which I guess is Egypt, Ashur, which I think is Assyria, and then there was Cush, and then the other side of it with the Hamitic people, and Cushites in particular, are Jews are forbidden to, I guess, have relations with them, whatever. That seems to me the seeds of some racism, and that's just a comment that occurs to me and it starts here in this recitation of these names and lineages. Although Ashkenaz comes from Jaffa or Yaphtha, which is not Ham, but it's kind of interesting, and it carries out, I think, if I'm not mistaken, throughout later in the Torah.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it is really easy to kind of just gloss over this section, and I probably, for the most part, will continue to do so, at least today, because I'm not really prepped to speak on in a response to your question in a way like feels informed enough to be worthwhile. But I did have a similar reaction when reading over it, like how much of this is kind of in just this section that's easily kind of able to be skimmed over in Noach, but that keeps popping up. I mean, forget just in the five books of the Torah, but well beyond into the prophets and into the writings. And so there are definitely kind of some history lessons that I think would be worthwhile, you know, giving this a closer read and a closer study, and seeing where and why and how these things continue to pop up. So thank you for pointing that out. And then Jean, if you want to unmute.
I'm just puzzled by a textual note on page 52 under the depravity of Canaan. It says, much time has elapsed since the flood. Noah now has a grown grandson in the singular. And I don't know if you can shed any light on that for me. I don't see any reference except when we get to chapter 10 and they start all the lineage stuff, talks about his sons having children, but can you help me with that?
In terms of what? In terms of much time having elapsed?
Why is it singling out, he now has a grown grandson, like one?
I think it's because that grown grandson is Canaan, and Canaan comes to be such a kind of a central figure in this episode of being cursed. It's kind of, the commentary, I think, is fitting itself to the narrative. And it's distinct because, Canaan is called out again and again. And I think it does have to do with this like establishing of lineages, the establishing of kind of how the world is going to be split out. And when Noah talks, he aims it specifically at his two sons and his one grandson, who is the son of his third son, if that makes sense. So I think it almost needs to kind of emphasize, the Eitz Chaim wants to explain why this is, why these distinctions get made a little bit.
Thank you, that makes sense.
Yeah. And Sharon, since you are unmuted, I will hand it over to you and let you take us through the healing service, please.
Okay, well, let's start the healing service all together, please. Are you going to put the words up? Or?
No, I think we know it well enough. I'd rather people be able to look at each other, I think.
Okay, let's sing the words together then that we all hopefully know. Mi sheberach avotenu mikor habracha limotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Amen. Mi sheberach imotenu mikor habracha lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen. Mi sheberach avotenu v'imotenu, Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov, Moshe v'Aharon, David u'Shlomo, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel v'Leah, Bilha v'Zilpa, U'yivarech v'yirafeh et hacholim, B'nei Avraham v'Sarah, B'nei Adam v'Chava. May God, who blessed our ancestors, bless and heal all those in need of it now. And as I read the names of the people we know, let's keep in mind all the names that we don't know. And particularly right now, what's haunting me are the 545 children abandoned without parents and an ability to reconnect with them. But there are many others too. Joan Lysick, Shoshana Bat Pinchas V'Chana, Meir Ben Fega V'Aaron Yitzchak, Dennis McNeely, Jess Kramer, Alexis Watson, Joel Gordon, May Daub, Bob Jelly, Bruce Mallory, Michael Cohn, Alan Mann, John O'Brien, Jacques Mansay, Carol Barker, Catherine Doloff, Ken Bosey, Chana Bat Rivka, Lorraine Danila, Denise Stelmach, Yitzchak Ben Yisrael, Madeline Blake, Rachel Barcelona, Corey Brown, Kara Smoley, Folios Rales, Nama Chava Bat Benjamin Barut, Chana Esther Bat Ayala Hadar. And if you have a name that you would like to have included, if you would raise your hand or in some way indicate, now Alex can unmute one by one.
Yeah, Bob.
Jones Staley, Kurt Curtis, Daniel Salinas, Carol Freeband.
Thanks, Bob. Joel,
Susie Williams.
Barry,
Josh Haskins.
Sue. Oh, Sue, you're still muted.
Hi, Lori and Bruno Schurz and Bryce Buccino. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. Mike,
Dina Bracha Bat Miriam.
yeah, Mom.
Deborah Susana Bat Matilda.
And Barbara Ann.
Go ahead.
Dov Ber B'Yona V'Chava, Edelnesha Bat Zev V'Etanesha, Chaya Yehudit Bat Ruven Eliyahu Chalevi V'Edelnesha, Avraham Ben Zev V'Etanesha, Chaya Sora Bat, I don't know the parents, Benita Wilson, Neil Shapiro, Danielle Rutes, Jeffrey Klein, Nate Hoskin, Greg Bow, Patricia Kincaid, Judith Kindling Caravan, Andrea Bursa Liang, Kate Liang, Woody Liang, Pam Matson, Patricia Trefferden, and Molly Varner.
And let's just take a couple more seconds to include all the other people whose names we don't know or we're not thinking of. And of course, all the people who need healing beyond physical healing, which is to say nothing of all the people who need physical healing as well. Whenever you're ready, Sharon.
בעבור שאנחנו מתפללים בעבורם, בשחר זה הקדוש ברוך הוא ימלא רחמים עליהם, להחלימם ולרפאותם, ולהחזיקם ולהחיותם, וישלח להם מהרה רפואה שלמה מן השמיים, רפואת הנפש ורפואת הגוף. שבת היא מלזעוק רפואה קרובה לבוא, השתה בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ונאמר
Amen. Thank you, Sharon. I do also just want to quickly give you all a compliment. I know that our goal through all of this was not to get necessarily more comfortable with technology or much better at Zoom, but as a group, we have all gotten much better at Zoom. I now feel like I am probably scrambling and fussing more than any of you, as you've all gotten a lot more used to muting, unmuting, all that stuff. And so I know, again, as we say, this is not a skill set we hope to have to use for too much longer. But I am really, I do admire kind of how everyone has adjusted and gotten built up the skills they need to make this a meaningful communal experience. I do want to read the Haftorah this morning. The Sephardic version is super short. It's from Isaiah. It's only 10 verses. And it's got some nice imagery in there, but it also really does it elevates this idea of the covenant with God in that we just read about in Noah, the promise and the covenant to basically not do any of this again. And I think it's interesting to see that, this idea that was put forward in the second parsha in Genesis come back through in the words and ideas of Isaiah. So I'm going to read the super short Sephardic version. It's on page 65. It's Isaiah chapter 54. verses 1 through 10. So I will say the brachot, and then I will put it up on the screen for us to follow along. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar binim tovim v'ratzav v'divreihem hanemarim be'emet. Baruch atah Adonai habocher b'torah u'Moshe avdo u'Yisrael amo v'ha'emet v'tzedek. Rani akara lo yalada pitzli rina vetzohali lo chala ki rabim b'nei shomema mibnei beula amar Adonai harchivi mikol mohalech viriot mishkenotaich yatu al tachsochi harichi metaraich v'tedotaich chazeki Ki aminu small tifrotzi zarech goyim irash ve'arim neshamot yoshivu al tiri kilo tevoshiv al tikalmi kilo tachpiri ki voshet ulamaich tishkachi v'cherpat almenotaich lo tizkari od ki vo alaich osaich Adonai tzvaot shemo V'go alech kedosh Yisrael Elohei chol haaretz yikarei ki keisha zuva v'atzuvat ruach kra'ach Adonai ve'eshet niurim ki tima'es amar Elohayich v'rega katon azavtich u'brachamim gedolim akabtech Shetzef ketzef histarti panai rega mimech uvechesed olam richamtich amar goalech Adonai ki me Noach zot li asher nishbati me'avor me Noach od al haaretz ken nishbati miktof alaich umigarbach ki halim yamushu V'hagvahot temutena v'chasti meitech lo yamush uvrit shlomi lo tamut amar merachmech Adonai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam tzur kol amim tzadik b'chol dorot ha'el haneman ha'omer ve'oseh hamdaber umkayim Shekol dvarav emet v'tzedek ne'eman atahu Adonai Eloheinu v'ne'emanim dvarecha v'davar echad midvarecha chor lo yashuv reikam ki al melech ne'eman rachaman atah Baruch atah Adonai ha'el hane'eman v'chol dvarav rachem al tzion ki veit chayenu v'al uvat nefesh toshia b'mhera b'yameinu Baruch atah Adonai Mesameach Tzion bevaneha Samcheinu Adonai Eloheinu Belyan avi avdecha Malchut Beit David neshichecha Bimhera yavo ve'agel libenu Al kiso lo yeshev zar v'lo yinchalu l'achrim et kvodo Ki b'shem kadshecha nishbata lo shelo yichben ero le'olam va'ed Baruch atah Adonai Magen David al haTorah ve'al havodah ve'al hanevim ve'al yom haShabbat hazeh shenatata lanu Adonai Eloheinu likdusha v'limnucha lechavod ultifaret al hakol Adonai Eloheinu anachnu modim lach umevarchim otach yitbarach shimcha befi kol chai tamid le'olam va'ed Baruch atah Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat. Amen. And I do just want to, the other reason that I wanted to read the Haftarah this morning that I forgot to say beforehand is just to kind of keep us grounded as a community. I know I just complimented kind of how great we're all doing making accommodations, but I also wanted to keep us grounded in a community, as a community, in the things that we're not doing that we expected to do. And of course, this week would have been Becca Katzen's bat mitzvah. You know, Alex did such a wonderful job last week, but he was supposed to be the second in a string of 4 straight b'nai mitzvah we were going to have from starting 2 weeks ago and going until next week with Nate. And so I just wanted, obviously none of the families are on this morning who would have been B'nai Mitzvah families, but I did want to kind of keep it in mind for the community that all these kids are still studying and they all have backup dates on the calendar, but also, them and their families were excited to, for these specific days and times, and we should keep that in mind as well. So I did just want to, reading the Haftarah is my way of honoring all the bar and bat mitzvah kids who are not doing it in the month of October. So let's transition just for a couple more minutes to talk about rainbows. And we've already kind of brought up some of the things that I want to highlight and talk about, but I do want to kind of create a larger context, and especially, there's nothing wrong with taking a couple minutes to think about rainbows. I can do that any day or time, I think. So the rainbow that is actually described in this morning's text, in the Torah text, is actually referred to directly as God's bow. It's not called a rainbow, it's called God's bow. And it's also referred to as an oat brit, a sign of a covenant. And this is the first of many references that we'll get to covenant throughout the Torah. And this one specifically is a covenant between God and all of humanity. But as we continue to work our way through the book of Genesis, we will see other covenants established, both between God and Abraham, between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and various people who play roles in their lives, and also, of course, very famously, God and all of the people Israel. And we'll see this most concretely coming up with Abraham and the idea of Brit Milah as a covenant, of circumcision as a covenant, but it's something that comes up over and over again throughout the Torah. But this covenant is kind of consecrated over this symbol of a rainbow. And obviously rainbows are special, right? They're striking, they're beautiful. I don't think I've ever been around someone when a rainbow appeared in the sky and that person's reaction was meh, or, I've seen this before, let's keep walking. I think whenever we're lucky enough to look up in the sky and see a rainbow forming or just formed, we realize how special it is. And I think part of that is because by their very nature, rainbows are ephemeral and unpredictable. Even though, as Joel referenced, on some level of science, they're always there. To our naked eye, they certainly are not always there. It's something that we know. We know it's special when we see it, I think, just intrinsically and deep down. But also, if we look at the text closely, the rainbow as a sign of the covenant is not for us. It kind of says over and over again that this is actually something that God should look down upon and see the rainbow and remember. And more specifically, that it's a sign for God to see the rainbow and remember God's covenant of kind of non-destruction that he is promising Noah. The language of the text, when read carefully, makes me think that the next time I see a rainbow, my thoughts should be, oh, look at that amazing thing. God is remembering that all living things shouldn't be washed away in a great flood. How awesome is that? Which obviously doesn't quite align with what I actually, like to think when I see a rainbow. And some rabbinic sources actually do interpret kind of rainbows as a sign this way. The Talmud teaches that during the lifetimes of the most righteous people, no rainbows are ever visible in the sky, because the merit of those tzaddikim is so great that God wouldn't need any reminder that the earth would ever be in peril, or that the earth would ever deserve any of God's wrath. And this was said to be the case in two different generations. And I'm not asking any of us to suspend our disbelief and assume that this natural phenomenon wasn't seen anywhere during the lifetime of the great Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. But maybe we can just recontextualize what the symbol of the rainbow, which in other places is described as one of the miraculous things created at the last moment of twilight on the sixth day, what this represents and what this could have represented to different, generations of Jewish thinkers. And as Sharon pointed out, the word for rainbow in Hebrew is keshet, which is the same word as a bow, a bow and arrow bow, which is a weapon, right? It's something, it's a tool of aggression. And the commentators, principally the Ramban, Nachmanides, also find this language to be significant. The Ramban writes that the bow is curved, so the rainbow is curved up in the sky, right? It's pointing towards the sky. And that is not an accident. Obviously, that's the way nature works. But it's pointing towards the sky intentionally and not pointing down towards the ground. Because with the rainbow pointing up towards the sky, hopefully we're seeing it as a symbol of peace and reassurance. Were the rainbow pointing down, humanity might look up and see it as a symbol of God's aggression, right? As if kind of expecting arrows to come raining down. Instead, Ramban hopes we see it as a sign of peace, and he writes that this is the way of warriors. When they call out for peace from their enemies, they too hold their weapons upside down in their hands. So again, maybe not the most reassuring perspective, right? I can't say that I necessarily love this warrior imagery of God, right? That the best we can hope for from this symbol is that arrows of war and aggression aren't raining down upon humanity and the world. But I do want to bring one other kind of interpretation that comes from Breshit Rabbah, which is a compilation of rabbinic midrash on the book of Genesis from Talmudic times, written mostly anonymously. And they teach that in these verses that we shouldn't read the word as kashti, my bow, but rather kishuti, which means my likeness, an object like me. This would render the verse, I have set my likeness in the cloud. I have set my likeness, the rainbow, in the clouds, and it shall serve as a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. The commentary continues, is it possible to read the verse this way? Yes. Just as the rinds of a fruit are similar to the fruit itself, so it is with the rainbow and the glory of God. Which the fruit metaphor part is a little bit weird, but I do really like this idea of the rainbow serving as kind of a manifestation of the glory of God. And I just really like the idea, again, the text emphasizes over and over that this is kind of a reminder for God, but it also, grounded in reality, it is a beautiful, visual, present thing, right? There's no way that humanity can see a rainbow and think it's only for God. And I think both in the universality of God's covenant that we're talking about here, right? That it's protecting not just the Jewish people, not just all of humanity, but really all of creation. And this idea that it is something between all of creation and God. I think looking at the rainbow as a manifestation up in the sky of God's likeness or God's glory, or really just like a hint of what is divine and beautiful. I think, and I hope that we can kind of return to this image as a rainbow, not just as a weapon put aside or as something that kind of reminds us that sometimes the earth perhaps deserves to be destroyed, but really something, again, that ties us back to a little bit of what it means to be in the image of God, what it means to be part of a godly creation, where we're not focusing on wiping things out because they've done bad, but really improving things from the ground up, because there is inherent glory and beauty and goodness. And I hope that's something we can take with us. I see Jerry wants to say something. Jerry, go ahead and unmute.
I must tell everybody that this week I saw the most vivid rainbow I've ever seen in my life. Looking out the 8th floor window of the Heritage Towers, I see a beautiful view of all the colors of autumn across the street. And up above that was this rainbow, so very vivid. And the first thought in my mind was, no messing around. You got to hear the story of Noah this Shabbat. So there it is.
Nice. Thank you, Jerry. I'm glad you got to experience that. You know, and there is a bunch of rain scheduled for the forecast this week. And you know, the next couple of weeks are ones where I hope we can find times and moments to appreciate beauty and God's glory and hope, right? I think being able to look out our window and see a rainbow is something we're all going to want and cherish if we're lucky enough to get that over the next, really any time, but I think especially over the next couple of weeks. And I hope that's something we can all try to carry with us. Any other thoughts or comments? I know we already kind of touched on a lot of what people came up with on their own, that the rabbis came up with, you know, hundreds and thousands of years ago. So I don't know if anyone still has anything they want to chime in with before we move on to the end of services. Great. Well, I'm going to close the ark. And we will continue. I'll invite everyone to unmute for the full Kaddish. I'm not going to put it up on the screen, but just so we can participate responsibly. Yikada v'ikadash me rabba. Alma divrach yirtei v'amlich malchutei. B'chaychon v'yamechon v'chay l'chol Beit Yisrael. B'agala v'zman kari v'meru. Barach v'shtabach v'tvar v'shom v'naseh v'tadar v'tlei v'tlal shmei d'kudesha brichu Eila mikol berchata v'shirata truchata v'nechamata damiran be'alma v'meru Amen. V'kadas torodon d'chol Beit Yisrael kadam l'hon v'shmaya v'meru Amen. Yeshlam rab min shemaya v'chaim aleinu v'al Yisrael v'meru Amen. Oseh shalom imromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al Yisrael v'al Yisrael tevel v'meru Amen. And we will continue with aleinu, which I will put up on the screen. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol atei gedula leotzer breishit shelo asanu kegoye haratzot velo samanu kemishbechot adama shelo sam chelkenu kahem vegoralenu kechol hamonam v'anachnu korim umishtachavim umodim Lifnei melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu shehu noteh shamayim v'yoseh la'aretz u'moshe v'ikaro b'shamayim imal u'shchinatu zo v'gavhei meromim hu Eloheinu einod Emet malkeinu efesu ato kakatu v'torato v'yadatayom l'hashivota el levavecha ki Adonai hu Elohim בשמיים ממעל ועל הארץ מתחת אין עוד ככתוב בתורתך אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו echad. And we'll continue with Mourner's Kaddish. This week, congregation Ahavas Achim marks the Yortzeitin of Abraham Edelstein, William Mann, Meyer Rutchick, Phyllis May Braverman, and Rosalind Hirsch. May their memories be a blessing. And we will continue with the Mourner's Kaddish. I invite you to unmute yourselves and join me in the Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah ve'alma divrach yirtei ve'amlich malchutei v'chayechon u'yomechon u'chayei v'chol beit Yisrael v'agala v'zman pariv v'imru amen.
Amen.
V'hei
Shmei Rav
v'olam umei omayach. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnasei v'yitadar v'yitalei v'yitalal shemei dekudashah Eila min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata damiran da'alma v'imru amen.
Amen.
Kehei shomaraba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael amen.
Amen.
Oseh shalom v'rama uyaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru
Amen.
You may be seated one last time. Shabbat shalom, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining and for really kind of keeping us throughout the Torah reading, having some really engaged and interesting conversation and reflection on Noah and on the story of Noah and the rainbows and everything else. Couple of things going on around the shul. As always, we're continuing on with our Tuesday night adult ed, which has had some really wonderful discussions. I'm also just going to kind of in advance ask people to keep a close eye on the e-blast. There's two different small fundraisers going on at the moment. I don't want to push too much talk about money, but one is a really wonderful opportunity to get some vegetables from Max Farm and support the women's group. And the other is a really wonderful opportunity to get yourself yourself or loved ones in your family, some beautiful Hanukkah candles, because Hanukkah, thankfully, I think at this point is not that far off. And it's a really wonderful way to prepare for Hanukkah and to support CAA. The other things that I'll just kind of throw out, not super concretely, but would be open to kind of knowing if people are interested or not. And I realize this is a reasonably small group. But at the ritual committee meeting, we talked about the possibility of starting a once a week weekday minyan. So a Thursday morning, short morning service. So that we'll likely experiment with it at some point in the month of November. So if you're interested in that, please keep your eye on the e-blast. And the other thing that I'm very loosely thinking about, but will also depend upon is if this is something people would appreciate, was if we do want to open up either some sort of a communal space for prayer or meditation on election day morning, kind of before the day starts, either just to, again, probably not too much discussion because I know anxieties are going to be high and I don't want to get into what will likely be pretty contentious political things that are going to happen over the next couple of weeks and months, but really just a place to try to connect with your friends and or with God or with some kind of inner spirituality to kind of maybe help offset some of that anxiety that's coming our way. So if that's something people would be interested in, I mean, for the people here, if you could nod or shake your head if that's something you'll like, because it would probably need to go on the calendar now. Okay, great. Are those hands want to say something, or those hands like you'd be open to it? All right, Sharon, go ahead.
I just want to say that we did something like that after the morning after Election Day in 2016, and it was really helpful for people who were utterly freaked out.
Yeah.
I think it would be good to have something like that available. I would really appreciate it, no matter what happens the day before. Yeah.
Great. All right. So let's loosely. I will. Yeah, Mike.
Well, so what I was going to say, I remember what Sharon said, and I remember that service, which was the day after Election Day. And I'm not so sure that, I don't know the day, I don't know when we should have it, is what I'm trying to say. We should have it. And so I'm open on that. But the other thing was, we're going to have, I think, Alex, if you saw my email right before Shabbat, we're working towards we're not working towards it. A congregation, Beth Israel, which has the band Bashir, that many of you have experienced at our synagogue when we were live, is having what they call Shabbat Chai. With the band has been able to put together some new stuff, and it's going to be on November 20th. And there should be an e-blast about that, and it'll be via Zoom, and it'll be later. It'll be at 7:30 at night. It will be a real Shabbat service, not a few things before Shabbat. If you didn't mind me mentioning that, Alex, I hope that was okay.
No, that's great. I mean, I'm glad that. Thank you for bringing that to our attention, and I will certainly be pushing it as we get closer to the date. But it'll go on the calendar and start showing up in the e-blast. So thank you. And as far as when, listen, I think one of the things that we're all being told to get ready for is that like this election is obviously going to be different in so many ways. And one of the things is like the day after Election Day might not be. So, yeah, I mean, I think the reason I said Election Day morning is because that's when I feel like I'm going to want to connect and like take this time for either prayer or for just like some reflective space. If people are interested, again, the wonderful thing about Zoom is that pretty much everything is low-hanging fruit, right? It's not like I need to worry about my commute to Boston or need to worry about getting people in the synagogue or, this is the kind of thing where I am really open to kind of hearing what kind of space and time people want. Because just because we do it on Tuesday doesn't mean we couldn't do it again on Wednesday or Thursday or the Tuesday following. So, keep that in mind. Feel free to kind of keep me posted after Shabbos. Again, my kind of inclination is to do it early on Tuesday morning, both because I think partially just because that's a prayer space that allows us to both be in the moment and look forward a little bit, like look forward to the day and kind of send some prayers and intentions for safety and fairness and all the other things that are so important in the election process. But I'm open to hearing other opinions as well. Any other questions, comments, announcements before we close up with, yeah, Mike?
Just one little thing. This is our friends, the Lied To, Susan Levine and Doug Quartler, are performing tonight at Metzy's from 5:30 to 7:30. I believe it's outside. So I just mentioned that because I missed them and I missed the coffee house, I think. And it just occurred to me because it's tonight. We should, when you said things on Zoom, Susan, are you there? I would like to work towards having a Zoom coffee house if this continues longer sometime, when we can plan to have it, if it's possible.
Yes, I've thought about that, and I think it's a great idea if the folks in the music community would be up for doing it on Zoom. I think that'd be awesome.
Great. So we will we'll put that on our collective, we'll get the gears going. And thank you, Mike, for keeping us tuned into what's going on musically in the Jewish world and the Newburyport world. That's wonderful. Yeah. All right, we will continue with Hatikva followed by Kiddush. If you would like to rise for Hatikva, please do so. Kol od balevav penima nefesh Yehudi homia ulafate mizrach kadima ayin letzion Sophia. Od lo avda tikvatenu ha-tikva bat shnot alpayim liot am chofshi be'artzenu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim liot am chofshi be'artzenu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat La'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael oti le'olam oti le'olam. Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. Ki shesh yamim asa Adonai et hashamayim et haaretz v'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. V'yom hashvi Shabbat v'yinafash Shabbat v'yinafash Shabbat Vayinafash v'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. Al kein bracha na'etem hashvavi gadsheu savri. Bat Adonai Eloheinu melech olam borei peri hagafen.
Amen.
Amen.
Baruch Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam,
Shakol
yeh
Yedvorah.
Amen. Shabbat shalom, everyone. May we all have a week filled with rainbows and happiness and health. Great to see you all.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, friends.
Good to see you, everybody.
Stay healthy, everybody.
Good Shabbos.
Good week.
Well, indeed.
Shabbos.
Thank you.
Shabbos.
Alex,
Yes.
just to clarify, I just realized when you're talking about this, you're talking about the morning, the Tuesday morning, right?
Yes.
Of because I was talking about the day after is what we had done last time.
Yeah, like I said, I'm
because we needed it. I don't know,
That's what I
we're
meant.
talking about preemptive, like Tuesday before.
I would go for Tuesday morning.
Yeah,
You go
maybe
day after,
that's what we
some
should-
people will be happy, some people will be sad. It's
it's more than sad, but yeah, okay.
well,
But I think
I
Tuesday
agree.
morning, a preemptive prayer might be a good idea.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
that's kind of what I had in mind. And like I said, if we want to make space for more than that, let me know. I mean, we can even check in Tuesday, like we can have it open Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning, and Thursday morning, as far as I'm concerned. But
And then-
I'm most inclined to do
When it's decided.
Tuesday morning because I do want to kind of hold on to as much
Hope.
hopeful prayer as possible. And I think, yeah. So that's where I'm coming from.
No, this year, I think that's a good idea. Thank you. I was on a different page and yeah.
That's what I was trying. It's confusing. I mean, we have to pray for other things. I mean, regarding this too, like peace. But
Yeah.
that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
What time is the earliest people would want to do on a Tuesday morning? I know this is a small subset, but it's also a subset that is likely to want to participate.
Oh, it doesn't have, for me, it doesn't have to be early, and I would just assume it not be super early, but
I mean, I don't think depending on the time, I know Ann has an eye doctor appointment and I don't think I can make it because because she gets to drive, I have to go with her.
Right.
So it's irrelevant to me.
Well, for me, actually, earlier is better because theoretically I do drive to Boston, so it would be nice to be able to do it before I drive. So I was thinking like 7:30, but if that's too early for people.
That's fine.
Well, Alex,
That's fine.
see what you
Okay.
can do. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Well, but what I can do if people can't show up for it doesn't have all that much use. So,
I think we'll show-
7:30 sounds great.
all right, great.
7:30 is good.
Wonderful.
That's
Thank you.
fine.
And Joel,